Hi, my name's Jakub. I'm a music producer from Indianapolis, Indiana, and this is the Behringer DeepMind 12. I've owned my DeepMind 12 for about 3 years now. I've gigged with it, I've used it extensively for sound design. It's even become my primary MIDI controller in my music production setup. But despite all of that, I am going to be getting rid of my DeepMind 12 in the near future. But that's not because I don't love it. In fact, I think the Behringer DeepMind 12 represents some of the best value that you can get in an analog polysynth available on the market today. It has 12 voices, 2 oscillators per voice, a 4-slot digital effects engine, an 8-slot modulation matrix with 124 destinations, a control sequencer, all kinds of amazing stuff. And it retails for $700 US. That's up there in terms of value with things like the Korg Minilog XD, right? So if you're looking to buy your first analog polysynth, I really couldn't recommend the DeepMind 12 enough. And if you're really serious, you can email me. I'll link my email below. So why am I doing this video then? This piece of gear does mean a lot to me. Like I said, it's been the center of my music production life for the last 3 years. I've played it basically every day that I've owned it. I've poured thousands of hours into it. And so I want this video to sort of be a retrospective. For me, honestly, I think this piece of gear deserves a tribute. So what I want to do is first have a high-level overview of the synth, its layout, its features, some pretty camera shots of the synth itself, and then I'll dive into some patches that I think are cool that I've designed. Next, I'll share some tips and tricks that I've come across while learning this thing for the last 3 years, things that might not be immediately obvious to someone picking up the synth for the first time. And then finally, I'll shut up and share some footage of me playing the synth. Please enjoy. All right, let's get into it. So to initialize a patch on the DeepMind 12, you'll hold the program button and then hit compare. And that'll start you out with this patch you hear now. It has 2 oscillators per voice, 2 LFOs, 3 envelopes, and like I said earlier, an 8-slot modulation matrix. So let's get into it. I'll talk about the oscillators first. Oscillator 1 it comes with 2 different waveforms, a sawtooth and a pulse. Let's just leave the saw for now. Did you hear that? Here's the pulse. Of course, has pulse width modulation. I like that the pulse gets very, very thin. It goes, I think, all the way up to 1% or 99%, depending on how you look at it. Oscillator 2 is a square wave. That's the only waveform it has, but this tone mod is an interesting wave shaping function that introduces all kinds of overtones, harmonics. That, along with the oscillator sync, allows for some crazy, crazy sounds. There's a really wide range of timbral possibilities that you can approach with those 2 parameters alone. Of course, there's also a noise generator for each voice. You don't need to hear that. Moving on. This is a polysynth. It's got 12 voices, so of course it's got some good poly modes to go along with it. It defaults to the poly mode, which is 1 voice per key. Another common one you'll end up using a lot, the unison 2 mode, which of course is 2 voices per key. People watching this who know their synth history might have already caught that this thing is based on the Roland Juno 106. And like the 106, the DeepMind 12 has digitally controlled oscillators, which means that there's very little instability, really no instability with the tuning of the oscillators. Some people like that. Some people do like the warmth that comes with slight tuning drift in oscillators, right? And so you'll hear that with no instability, 2 voices stay locked in phase with one another like this. However, this synthesizer comes with this oscillator drift parameter, which, if you dial it in, allows the oscillators to slowly, randomly drift in and out of tune with one another, recreating that instability that the vintage synths had. So check this out. I mean, the difference is stark. You can immediately hear them drifting in and out, and that's at a very low value. You can actually push this all the way to emulate even a broken synth, which might have its applications. Who knows? So I'll leave that at a moderate low value. Moving on, the filter sounds great. It's a true analog filter. I'll give you a filter sweep just for your listening pleasure. Let's do that on the sawtooth for some more overtones. This is the 4-pole mode, by the way. And here is the 2-pole mode, which is going to be a little brighter, of course. This is a self-resonant filter, meaning that it can produce sound on its own without even needing the oscillators to be engaged. I will warn you, though, that if you push the resonance past about 75%, things start to get a little loud, so I've preemptively turned down the volume for you so I can demonstrate this. So yeah, I tend to keep it 75% or lower for most of my patches. So let's leave that up and re-engage the sawtooth. Nice. So, moving back over to the envelopes. We have 3 envelopes, VCA, VCF, and mod. VCA and VCF come pre-mapped to those parameters respectively. However, all 3 of these envelopes are actually identical and can be mapped to whatever. And you can do that via the mod matrix. So let's hop in there next. The mod matrix is incredibly flexible, 8 slots, 132 destinations. And something I really like about it is, say we want to map the mod wheel right here. Where's that guy? Say we want to map the mod wheel to the filter cutoff, right? So as I mentioned, there's a lot of destinations, and one drawback of this synth, one thing I dislike about it is this knob is a little bit clunky. If you try to go quickly through a list of options, sometimes it will not work properly. One click will not correspond to moving one increment in the list. But there's an easy bypass for that when selecting things in the mod matrix. All you do is you hold the mod button and you gently toggle the fader that you want to assign, and it instantly populates in that slot, right? Boom. That's brilliant. I'm really glad that Behringer decided to include that. So let's go ahead and dial in a bit of depth. So with the mod wheel closed, we hear nothing, and as I open it, let me add a little bit more depth. Nice. Very nice. Lastly, I'll just touch on the LFOs. LFOs are great. There's 2 of them per voice, 7 shapes per LFO. I really like the sample and glide shape that comes with these LFOs. It's different from sample and hold, in that sample and hold will discretely choose values and jump to them, whereas the sample and glide is more of like a random wander between the values that it selects. It's smoother, and I find that it's a lot more musical in certain applications. That's all I want to touch on right now. There's a lot of other stuff that I don't have time for, like the arpeggiator, these chord modes, the control sequencer. Those are a little out of the scope for what I want to talk about because I want to get into some patches. All right, so that patch you just heard was Mass Pad, short for massive, of course. This is one of my favorite patches I've created. I've used it a bunch in my own music. And so I'll talk about a little bit of what's going on under the hood. So oscillator 1, nothing too special here. It's just the sawtooth wave doing its thing. Despite the size and volume of the pad, I'm actually not using the pulse wave on oscillator 1. I'm just using the sawtooth. A lot of that size you're hearing comes from what's happening on oscillator 2. I'll include a screenshot of the actual patch after the fact because the front panel does not correspond to what you're hearing. But what's happening on oscillator 2 is that the pitch is being transposed up a fifth from the note being played on oscillator 1. So I'll demonstrate really quick. I'll play a G. And if I take out the sawtooth, you'll hear that oscillator 2 is playing up a fifth from what's happening in oscillator 1. And what that does is I've made it quiet enough that you almost don't perceive it as a separate note, but rather as an overtone of what's happening in oscillator 1. And so when you start to play these big chords, like it really contributes to the sense of space, I think. Moving on to the envelopes, I think the VCF envelope is doing most of the heavy lifting for this patch, particularly the very slow attack. I think opening the filter slowly creates a sense that the pad is almost heavy, like it takes a second to get going, like it has inertia. Like if I were to shorten that attack, it would really lose, I think, the sense of space. Let me try that really quick. Yeah, it just doesn't sound as heavy without that attack. So let's bring that back to where it was. So yeah, I think that helps a lot. I can't touch on everything in this patch. I think another important thing to talk about, though, would be the mod delay reverb effect. One of the most versatile effects in this engine, something this engine has a few of, is like multi-effects, I guess you could call them, which are effects that have more than one function, but only take up one slot of your 4, right? And so mod delay reverb, great example of that. It's delay and it's reverb, and it includes modulation that can control both of them, right? And so if I take that out, you'll hear just how much it's doing for the patch. Here it is with. Here it is without. It's a lot narrower. The release is a lot shorter. Still nice and thick sounding, but doesn't quite have that reverb. So I think that reverb like this is pretty essential for any big, spacious pad. Yeah. All right, so let's move on. All right, so just like with the last patch, I'll include a screenshot at the end of this so that you can see exactly where all the faders are supposed to be located. Because again, what you're seeing with these faders does not really correspond to the patch. But this is Guitar Dream. It's meant to sound like a guitar. It was my attempt, actually, a few months after I purchased the synth, it was my attempt at trying to push the realism of the synth. Just how close could I get to a real string guitar sound? I do think it sounds a lot like a string. I don't think it sounds like a guitar per se, but it does sound like it comes from some sort of maybe futuristic metallic string instrument. And a lot of that credit has to go to the tone mod parameter on oscillator 2. So I'll even take out oscillator 1 because all that's doing is providing that strong fundamental with the pulse wave. Let's take that out. Here is what's happening on oscillator 2. Honestly, it might sound a little more realistic with just oscillator 2, but I do like having the warmth and presence that oscillator 1 provides. But you can tell that all of that string effect comes from this tone mod parameter. And all I did was dial in just a little bit of it. So here it is with the no tone mod. Doesn't really sound very stringy, but just a little bit. It gives it this twanginess, these like subtle overtones that are really reminiscent of a string. This one's pretty simple, honestly. Obviously the reverb is contributing a lot. This is another one of those multi-effects that I mentioned in the last patch. This one, of course, is chorus and reverb. I'll play without. Loses a lot of that space. So the effects tend to do a lot of heavy lifting on the DeepMind 12, and while you're designing patches, it is worth keeping that in mind. The other thing I think doing a lot of heavy lifting is that delay, and the delay has a bit of a bandpass filter on it to prevent those high frequencies from repeating for too long. If I were to open that high cut up, it would sound a lot brighter, which could be nice depending on what you're doing, but I thought it was more versatile to keep it closed. So yeah, so that's that patch. Cool, so the first trick that I want to touch on is a trick involving panning, right? The way that you'd probably go about adding some stereo width to a patch is you'd start by going to this pan spread parameter that's within the VCA edit menu. So here it is before I do anything. All the voices dead in the center. And if I bring in some pan spread, what that's doing is it's for each voice, depending on how far it is from this sixth voice, panning it either to the right or the left, right? So like, for example, voice 12 is being panned the furthest to the right, voice 1 is being panned the furthest to the left. And that stays, right? Add a little more, make it more obvious. And so what's nice about that is since it's somewhat randomly choosing voices as I play new chords, different chords end up being placed differently in the stereo field, right? But what if I want a single chord to move in the stereo field as I sustain it? That's not happening with the default pan spread parameter because once it selects its voice, it pans that amount to the right or left and just stays there for the duration of that voice's use, right? So what you can do if you want to add some more motion in the stereo field is map something to the VCA pan parameter, right? And what that's going to do is if you have that control source changing over time, then literally the stereo positioning of the individual voice will also change over time. So what I really like to do to create some motion is I'll map, say, LFO 1 or 2. In this case, I'm using LFO 2, using the sample and glide shape that I mentioned earlier. I'll map that to the VCA pan, right? So here it is again with nothing, dead mono. And then I'll go ahead and dial in the max amount of depth to that mapping and see how that sounds as I hold a chord. Now, if you've got headphones on, you're probably able to hear the difference where each individual voice is sort of swimming instead of just choosing a stereo position and staying there. So that's really nice for pads where you think you're going to be holding these long extended chords. And I think that it's a real improvement over just the standard pan spread parameter. All right, so the second trick that I want to explore isn't really one individual trick like the last one, but more is just kind of an exploration of the kinds of stringy and glassy tones that you can get out of the DeepMind 12. And I know I spoke about this earlier when I walked through the Guitar Dream patch, but I think it warrants a little bit more of a deep dive. So let's initialize our patch. Oscillator 2 is doing all the heavy lifting here, so I'll turn off Oscillator 1 entirely, actually. And I'll just move it up 1 octave using that range parameter in the edit menu, so putting us right in the middle. So let's go ahead and try to approach a nice metallic string, right? And so the first thing you'll want to do, this is nothing unique to the DeepMind, but you'll want to set your envelopes to decay at a pretty natural rate, and you'll want the volume and the filter cutoff to decay together, because that's what's going to sound the most natural. That's roughly what happens on acoustic string instruments. So we'll try to do that here. Make these two envelopes match, and then we'll use the envelope control on the filter to engage envelope control of the filter cutoff. And look, we're already halfway there, right? So where it gets interesting is this wave shaping and tone mod parameter, right? You'll hear that as soon as I dial in just a little bit of that, and I'll go ahead and extend the release too, but you hear those overtones that immediately appear. Those high twangy overtones. Let me dial in a little bit more release. Here's without. It's dull. It sounds maybe like a very dampened string, but this adds that extra bit of character that it needs. At this point, it's almost got a glassy texture to it, which I quite like. It's very clean, very pure sounding. We can also, if we want to make it sound a little bit less artificial, we can start to play with this sync parameter right here, right? And what this is doing is it's forcing the start of every waveform on oscillator 2 to match up with what would be coming from oscillator 1 if it were on, right? And so we can engage some pitch mod, knowing that the pitch mod now will not change the actual fundamental frequency of oscillator 2, but rather it will change the overtones. And we'll have the pitch mod follow LFO 1 by default, and we'll make it change pretty slowly. So you can hear that different notes have different overtones now, just like you'd get on a real string instrument. As your fingers change positions, as the instrument heats up or cools down, just adds a bit more realism. I'm going to dial it back just a bit, though. Yeah. Now we're talking. And that's a great start for a patch. From here, you'd probably go to tweak the envelopes a little more. You'd probably add some effects. You'd probably add some, aftertouch or mod wheel type stuff to make the patch a little more playable. But yeah, that's the skeleton of a great string or glass type patch on the DeepMind 12. There we go.